Hello everyone and welcome to this new online live conversation of l'École, the School of Jewelry Arts. My name is Gislain Aucremanne, I'm an art historian and I'm the conference project manager for the school, and I'm lucky to be with my dear friend and colleague Paul Paradis, who's also an art historian and a professor at l'École. Hi Paul.
Hi Gislain, how are you?
I'm very good, how are you?
Great to be here
Good.
at home.
Absolutely. We are in the library of the school in Paris, and today we are going to talk about a very specific topic on a type of piece of jewelry, brooches. But without missing a few information, let's just start with a few housekeeping details, if I may say. For those who know very well how it functions on Zoom, you know already what I'm going to say. But for those who are starting with us, just know that this talk will last 1 hour. At the very ending of this hour, we'll have a Q&A session. These questions, you will be able to ask them during the talk. We have our dear colleagues, Inezita for the Paris side and Alice for the Hong Kong side, collecting the questions. And in the same time, out of Zoom, via WeChat, Mina from Shanghai will collect also the questions, lots of questions from all over the world. For this moment, we'll be able to answer a selection of them, of course, and do our best to give you the best answers. So with no further ado, let's start immediately with our topic of today, which is the art of brooches. How can we say about brooches in a general way?
Well, here we go. Let's look at the brooch, the clip, the buckle, fermail, fibula, pin. All these words, since the early days of antiquity we're going to take you through, they all mean one thing, the brooch. And we're going to explain to you how it has evolved since really the dawn of humanity. We wanted to show you this beautiful brooch by a very famous interior decorator, movie set designer, very famous in the 40s on, Tony Duquette, because a lot of us think of these glamorous, very oversized brooches and when we think of a brooch. And this is a very particular period in the history of the brooch, which we're going to talk about today. He uses luxurious materials. You have some beautiful mother of pearl from abalone. You always have a sort of sun or a starburst and this beautiful 40-carat amethyst in the middle, just to get us in the mood.
Absolutely. And to answer to all these words all around, we have decided to talk about the history of the brooches thanks to 3 main chapters. On the first chapter, we are going to talk about how we move from something very, very functional at the beginning to a decorative side of the brooch. How the ornament moved from something utilitarian to something very ornamental. Then on chapter 2, we're going to understand how meaningful the brooch was in time and still is. How the emblems and the symbols of the brooches can be deciphered in time. Last but not least, we will understand, and that's our belief, that a brooch with its 3-dimensional aspect is a true work of art, is a piece of sculpture. So we're going to understand how this jewel could be considered as a sculpture in the final chapter. So let's move on to our first chapter, from functional to decorative. And for this, we're going to start at the very beginning, or almost, with the origins of brooches. So, here, on the picture, you have 2 images illustrating how it all started. Well, it started a bit before, we can say. Some of the experts will consider that probably in the middle of the 2nd millennia before Common Era, so we are in the 1600 BCE or 104,000 at the same time, so very long ago, some of the people decided to create something with a pin that could easily be useful for clothing, for fastening some of the clothes. Yes, we have to keep in mind the clothes had no button at the time, and buttons will appear in just the ending of the Middle Ages. So with just draped outfits, you will need to cover them, rub them, and to maintain them, pin something in. It was like a safety pin, we could say, in a way. You just pin in and obtain something which would maintain the clothing in the position you would have decided. With the pin, you would have something like a bow-shaped element to be the part you can take or take off easily. And step by step, they will realize, the goldsmiths, the designers of the time, would just think that this bow shape could be easily decorated, and all the ornament out of the pin could receive decoration. This is exactly what you see 1,000 years after the very beginning of brooches. We are with the fibula. Fibula is a word in Latin. The Latin name means fastener, so you really have this functional aspect. Look at the decorative side. You can see with these little beads, we call them granulation, little granules of gold. The craftsmanship of the gold which is there is absolute, and we're probably with some of the Etruscan community, so these civilizations who lived before the Roman Empire, but in the center of Italy, in between the modern cities of Rome and Florence, just to be exact. What is nice in it is that this type of fibula would represent, of course, a high status, but also a very, very functional object. And this idea of being useful is something that would be kept years after years, centuries after centuries, to the Middle Ages, which is a glorious moment of brooches. 2 months ago, Zita and you gave a talk about Middle Ages. It's something very, very important, a period which is very rich, 1,000 years of creation. But we have in mind that from, let's say, 1100s to 1400s of the Common Era, so we're now long later, we had some large brooches to be used to fasten also these heavy textiles they wore in the Middle Ages. And they used an old French word called fermail. Fermail comes from the word fermer, which means to close, to fasten, so really the same meaning as fibula in the ancient world. And it gives the idea that it was very present on the body, on the clothing, and it could be decorated with stones. This is precisely what you have with an object which we call in Italian spilla di can grande. Spilla is fibula or brooch. It is this idea of the fermail, the fastener, to clothe probably these large capes that the lords of war, the condottieri in Italy, probably had at the time. And it belonged to the possession of a lord of war, a lord of Verona in the north of Italy, called Can Grande della Scala. Look at how the pearls, how the cabochon cut gemstones give a lot of color in such piece, and it proves how the importance of the person was reflected with this piece. So he decided to be buried in his sarcophagus with this piece, and now it's in the museum in Verona. It gives you the importance of how everything started with the origins of the brooches. But you can realize we did not call it a brooch at the time. So how did it evolve?
That brooch is very famous, isn't it? The colors, they say, represent the different virtues. There's so many interpretations of that brooch.
Yeah.
Yes, so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to take a leap in time. We're going to skip to the 17th century because it was really the era when the brooch became the brooch or started to become the brooch. It was this bow motif that was so famous. A very famous French designer, Gilles Légaré and jeweler, he created designs. They were engravings that circulated with this bow. The bow becomes one of the rules of Baroque, what we say Baroque jewels. And you can see ladies, originally what's interesting is they were originally real bows with fabric. When you look at paintings, ladies and gentlemen sometimes, but mostly ladies, had these silk bows with a gem hanging down. And throughout the century, they evolved into completely gemmed pieces of jewelry. We call this a bodice ornament. Ladies wore those dresses with the very V-shaped bodice all through the 17th century and into the 18th century. And you have a very luxurious version. What's interesting here, it became mostly feminine, and it's still sewn onto the clothing. We're not yet in the age of the brooch with a pin that we know of. Mm-hmm. So this is a very important because we know this through museums and pieces that we see, and it's really, the jury's still out. When exactly did it become a pin? So we go all the way through the 18th century. This bow à la Sévigné or Légaré remains very, very popular. And of course, flowers come into play more in the Rocaille period, more asymmetrical. But we wanted to bring you to the Second Empire. When Napoleon III's nephew takes power, he relaunches luxury in France, and the brooch has its full glory. We are now in a brooch. There's a pin that attaches it to the front of the lady's bodice. So it's a yes, it's a bodice ornament, but it's a brooch. And this is Melerio, this great maison that's existed for 15 generations. This was really their, let's say, heyday in the Second Empire with all the balls thrown by Eugénie, the empress. And this piece is very historicist, orientalist. It was eclecticism of the Second Empire. And we love this piece because if you asked me which influence is it, you could say anything. They said it was Indian influence with beautiful garnets, pearls, and there's beautiful, these sort of, we call those little chutes that come down. So really, we're in the age of the brooch. There were authors like Elizabeth Gaskell in England. She said, brooches are everywhere. They're up and down, all around on people's dresses, with dogs painted on them, with weeping willows and hair. So the second half of the 19th century is really the age of the brooch, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Grand tour brooches, archaeological brooches, etc.
And as people travel, they can share the same passion for brooches.
Exactly.
It's true that they have in common these pieces, that they're all related to textile. Textile were very present,
exactly.
The large crinoline dresses, so you can just easily pin in wherever you want the brooches. And this is one thing which is important. The brooch has a common history as fashion evolved. And that's something that leads us to our next slide with Art Deco period. The 1920s was the roaring 20s, the little black dress, the flappers, people were dancing Charleston. So probably pinning a brooch was probably not the thing you would have in mind first. But they wanted, on these more soft textile, to fix onto the clothing, on the hat, on the jacket, on the lapel, some of the ornaments that could easily be in a way more versatilely transform and transpose one way or the other. And here we have example from the 1930s with the development of a certain type of brooch, which we will call the clip. A clip is easy. It gives the word comes from the sound, clip, the movement of it. It is something which is easy, and some people would say Louis Cartier, the famous Louis Cartier, the grandson of the founder, who was the creative director for Paris and developing the idea, saw ladies clipping some clothes for making them dry outside and said, yeah, let's have the same system to fasten them without a pin, which would be something very useful for clipping on softer fabrics or even in the hat or anywhere you want. And this is how you have the example on the left-hand side. In the middle, Ostertag, and other maison in Paris that was present on Place Vendôme, produced what we call a double clip brooch. Why is that the double name? Because here you see it in full ornament, larger one as a brooch, but you can divide it. It was the age of transformable jewels, dress clips, absolutely. And you can just wear them very symmetrical on both sides or clip them the way you want and have something more little in a way that could be, if you see from the back, clipped easily and maintained with the very same system of fastening it. What is a bit tricky, but not so hard to understand, is that the word clip could be used for many other types of fixing the brooch. And this is precisely what Van Cleef & Arpels produced in the 1930s. If you look at this clip from the back, you would see it's not the same system, but we keep the word clip to quote it. It has two pins to make it more stable on the body, to make sure it wouldn't move, and also for security reasons, if one would be unattached, the other one would be maintained. So you really have this idea of how the word could evolve in time, and from one jewelry house to the other, it could mean something very different. But it gave, since the 30s, a glorious age again for the brooch.
Exactly. We are talking about the same idea, that whether it's two pins, one pins, whether it's actually like a clothespin.
Yeah.
So we wanted to take you now into the 30s, and because after this Art Deco period, this purely sort of flat geometric, brooches start to take on much more volume. You get curves, you get yellow gold during the war and after, you get buckles and belts. And there was another phenomenon that came out, was costume jewelry. Think of Coco Chanel. She created those pearls, those sautoirs from 1924. She didn't mind if they were costume jewelry. The Bakelite bracelet cuffs. So here, this is actually a really fun story because Jean Schlumberger, of course, ends up with his own studio later on in the 50s at Tiffany. But before, he started making things like this. He made enameled clips, enameled buttons for Elsa Scapiorelli, the great couturière, one of the first to be on the cover of Time magazine. And he made these fun little animals as part of a collection called The Circus. Now, it was really Schlumberger for Scapiorelli. She understood as well that ladies might want to wear fun things. They don't necessarily want to wear diamonds and pearls all the time. And we have also couturiers like Dior. He said, taste is not about money, it's about knowing how to wear a brooch. Not only on your lapels, but a stylish lady can wear it on her scarf, in the pocket of her jacket, etc. So as you probably know, Dior was one of the first to create jewelry lines, costume jewelry lines. He worked with some of the finest producers, Chemema, Gripois, etc., as did Chanel. So we have let's call it the democratization of the brooch, if you will, with costume jewelry. So we're jumping again forward to the age of the badge or the pin. This was an invention of the 70s. I'm a child of the 70s, so I remember. Yeah. There's a machine called Badge a Minute, and you can actually make your badge yourself for political campaigns, to show compassion. On the bottom right is a very famous French association called Don't Touch My Friend. It's an anti-racism campaign launched in the 80s. You have the beautiful AIDS ribbon, which was visual aids to show compassion for people suffering from HIV when it was very, let's say, taboo in the 90s. You can have a rock band. You can have a political campaign. So we've taken you into this really democratization area of the brooch, which can have text on it and symbols.
Absolutely, and it gives a very symbolism aspect to the brooch, which leads us to our second chapter, emblems and symbols. As we said, a simple pin, even if it's a cheap object, could mean a lot, could reflect a thinking, could reflect a political decision, could reflect a social reality. And all these things, they actually started long ago with Middle Ages in particular. And we have decided, with Paul, we love the sentimental jewels. It's a topic we have had the pleasures many times to give a year ago. What is nice here is what we call the heart brooches. Heart brooches are a type of jewelry that was developed with the late medieval time. It reflects the courtly life that people really enjoy to express, to show their sentiment towards the lady they wanted to court. And what is nice here, you have two examples from the front and from the back of these heart-shaped brooches. So the heart is very easy to understand. It's the meaning of I'm giving my heart to you. In the back, most of the time you have in Gothic letters the inscription giving you a love message. So from my heart to you, I'm giving all to you. Sort of these sentimental messages that we know very well. What is really nice to see is that the heart shape is not the only one type of rose that was very important at the time. We have in the center a miniature representing another sort of brooch, which is what we call the ring brooch, because it has the shape of a ring, so it's a circular shape. And at a time when, before the 15th century, the engagement ring did not exist, it is interesting to see that giving a brooch to the loved one could mean you would be properly engaged in front of the society. So it's something very serious, very powerful in a way, that was given over here. Look at this miniature. Just love this double representation of the couple. Option 1, the couple on the left, which you can see on the screen, represents a man and a woman. And in the center, you have this ring brooch, this circular side of brooch. She is just putting her arm and hand over his shoulders, and he is just covering her and protecting her, putting his hand on her hip. Together, they feel they are together in love, and she accepted the gift, so it means they are going to be engaged. On the other side, option 2, you have the right couple. This one, it's a completely different story. And what is nice to see is, if you look at her face. She is not holding the ring brooch. Look at just her face, just saying with the hand, no, I'm really not interested. If you look at his face, he's just saying, okay, I understand, I'm not insisting. And he's just holding the brooch on himself, opening the hand saying, okay, no worries. And if you look down there at his foot, this part of his body is already moving far from her, saying, okay, this is the no. So two options, yes and no, which is there and declared in this manuscript by the meaning of this particular type of brooch.
He's taking rejection well.
Oh, yes. He must.
We hope.
We hope he is, yeah, for sure.
So we wanted to talk to you about these badges, male insignia, badges and medals. There was a phenomenon in the late Middle Ages where they started to create orders of chivalry. They were really reminiscent of the time of the Crusades, when you had the soldier, the monk going to the Holy Land. But they become very prestigious for royals, non-royals. They're religious, they're non-religious. Think of the Order of the Garter in England. So we wanted to show you this example. Hemmerle is a very interesting jewelry family. We'll talk more about their contemporary works later. But they started out, the two brothers, they purchased a factory that made medals and insignia. Because when you belong to one of these orders, you must wear your insignia and your medal. So they make these star-shaped, cross-shaped pieces with an enameled cross. You have the slogan of the club in the middle. And on the upper right, you have a very famous one that was made. It's the Order of Maximilian II. He was the king of Bavaria. So this family had very close ties with the princely family of Bavaria. And later we'll talk about the fact that they use their skills with working metals, let's say non-gold and non-precious metals, to do things very unusual, even today.
Absolutely.
But we wanted to show you this funny man. We think he's funny, Mr. Gudroitz. He's a chamberlain from the Russian Empire. Now, he has something like 40 badges and insignia. We tried to count. It's so dense. This painting exists. It's in the Museum of the Legion of Honor, just to show you the importance, the prestige that he felt belonging to all of these clubs. Luckily, you don't have to do a lot always. There's not, they're honorific. You don't have to always go to meetings, but there is a sense of prestige. And we like our Mr. Gudroitz because he's so proud of his 40 or some odd badges. And what's an interesting side story to this is in the 19th century, around this time, late 19th century, they started to make orders that were based more on merit than just because you were, just because.
Sure.
But the actual brooch in this sense becomes showing that you belong to these prestigious groups.
We have also asked ourselves how the brooch could have a reality all around the world. Of course, we have just 1 hour, as we said, so we just decided to pick up two very interesting examples to really understand how the idea, the concept of the brooch could really mean something in other parts of the world. So let's start with the right-hand side, where we have a pair of Berber fibula. So we really have this idea of the brooch with a large pin to cover also these draped clothing and pin in. It's all made out of silver, which is a favored metal for this north of Africa part. And what is really interesting in here is that they have decided to not have a figurative decoration, but to prefer some sort of geometric patterns. Triangles within triangles, with lozenges, with circular ornaments, with sort of floral decoration. They all together are like a spiritual shield. They have an amuletic power. They're a talisman to protect the person from everything that can attack the person within the desert. What is interesting to see and have in mind, the desert could be very, very dangerous for people. Dangerous animals could be there. The desert itself with, storms, with the heat itself, all these things could really need to have protection. They talked about what they call the jinns, the evil genies, and the idea was really to protect from them. This is why they put the color, this green and orange, yellowish color.
Every color has its meaning, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Protecting from the evil eye, for example.
For all the things that would be bad. And it proves that it's meaningful as a talisman to wear such type of brooch out of the functional aspect it keeps. The other piece on the left-hand side is from China. What is interesting is that, historically speaking, we had in time, centuries and centuries ago, on the large belts, these sort of belt hooks, which were these sort of brooches to be fixed and to be related to the clothing. Once again, fashion and brooches, they have a common story together. What is nice in here is that we are about 1880, so much later, under the Qing dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty from the mid-1600s to the very beginning of the 1900s. And what is nice to see is that at the time, these sort of large belts were not really worn by the Chinese noblemen. So in fact, what is good to know is that if there was no need for a bell, there was no need for a bell hook either. And they probably were kept as an object of art, put on a desk so you can put the brush with which you will make calligraphy, paint, whatever, even hanging on the wall when you can put a painting. So very other type of uses which the brooch from the original utilitarian side will give in an other aspect to it.
And of course, the jade. The jade is just
and
so
of course,
important.
Yeah.
It's the most
it's
precious
the
of stones,
material, the stone to use, definitely.
It's magical.
Thanks
it's
for adding
the link
it.
to the heavens. Yeah, the material, of course.
Yeah.
The materials are very important, whether they be precious or non-precious, in brooches.
Yeah.
Very, very important.
Speaking of material, there is one you're going to talk about on the left, aren't you?
Today, we'd like to talk to you about three political messages, but beautifully feminine political messages. On the left is a very interesting sort of jewel which came out of Berlin. It's called Berlin iron. Now, the history of it is that during the Napoleonic Wars with Berlin, with Prussia, the Prussians were fighting Napoleon in 1813 to 1816. This jewelry had already become popular, but especially during this war. It's made of iron. So the ironworks that were making arms start making these very delicate, beautiful pieces, almost lace-like. And the ladies would turn in their gold jewelry to show their patriotism, and they would wear iron jewelry, which is blackened with a very complex process. I think they melt linseed oil, and they put certain polymers or different things in the molten iron. But look at the beauty, and it's lace-like with this beautiful neo-Gothic star-like figure and these vine leaves. So the refinement of let's say, using a factory that usually makes large arms to make these very refined jewels. And the ladies would say, I gave gold for iron. They were very proud. So it's a very important part of the history of iron jewelry. It spread all through Europe. In fact, it became a fashion, really, like a lot of jewels.
Oh, definitely.
And this is, as you can see, there is a pin. And in the middle, we have something that's particularly it started in England, this idea of the suffragettes, ladies who'd like to vote, they'd like to participate in political life. In fact, ladies in England were the first to really start in the 1860s, a certain Emmeline Pankhurst. So what happened was these suffragettes, they risked their lives sometimes, really, and they did hunger strikes, and they finally got the vote in 1918. But the jewelry, this jewel has a very specific meaning. So if you use the green of that stone, I think it's an emerald or some kind of gemstone, if you take the green, you use the word give, and if you take the white of the pearl, white starts with W, women, and you take the violet of the amethyst, the vote. So it's a political message and a beautiful jewel. There were simpler ones, of course, but we wanted to show you this is a very Edwardian style, isn't it? These three colors, which can also represent hope, charity, and things. And we have, we're very proud to talk, well, I am especially because being American, Madeleine Albright was such an important political figure, Secretary of State, the first woman Secretary of State in history. That means the Minister of Foreign Affairs under Bill Clinton. Now, she had a very funny story. When she was ambassador to the United Nations, one time after a meeting with Saddam Hussein, it was during that difficult period of the Gulf War, he had written something about her in the press that she was a snake. So the next time she came to meet Saddam Hussein, she wore a snake pin. And she thought, this is fun. So she started buying mostly costume jewelry. And she would wear, when she became Clinton's minister, she would wear balloons or flowers if she was optimistic about negotiations. She would wear a turtle if she thought it was going too slow. So she wrote a very fascinating book called Read My Pins. And it became a classic, and she used it as a way to explain also the history of diplomacy and her messages. And she's wearing that beautiful peace dove by Cécile and Jeanne, wonderful French jewelers, who it was given to her by Leah Rabin the widow of Yitzhak Rabin, who is the prime minister of Israel, who had been assassinated, and it represents peace. So she used her jewels to really to show a message.
Yeah, very powerful messages, as you would see. And it proves how the brooch cannot be considered without the whole context
Exactly.
to understand and read the brooch. Read My Princess, it gives the whole understanding from her book. Let's move on to our final chapter, the jewel as a sculpture. And it's true, considering a piece of jewelry as a work of art is something very important when we study jewelry arts for sure, but particularly the art of the brooch. So we have one example to start with, actually two, from the 19th century, which gives this idea the brooch is sort of a portable sculpture, so an object of art that you can put on your body. What is very important compared to the other sorts of piece of jewelry is that this one can really have a three-dimensional aspect, and you can really see it from many sides. And the artists for the jewelry arts from the 19th century onwards really understood it. Here, this perfect example of Roman Meurice, one of the great jewelry designers of what we call Neo-Gothic, which is Middle Ages revival. It is the age when Victor Hugo wrote his novel about Notre Dame, the Cathedral of Paris, the period when the cathedral was restored at the time. And we know how, I mean, I'm from Paris, born in Paris, so Notre Dame, we all know what happened to the cathedral. We all suffered a lot from it. It's a very symbolic monument in Paris, and it gives inspiration to the jewelers. Look at this, these angels, they look like they come from the Gothic cathedrals. Look at the delicacy of the silver, how the way of chiseling, how engraving all the details is part of the delicacy he understood. But all these techniques, Roman Meurice took them from the world of the sculptures. So he knew sculptures very well. Pradier, in particular, was a sculptor he worked with. So it's just comparing and analyzing how finally they worked together. And Roman Meurice was also interested in the arts from the Renaissance period, in particular the famous Italian Benvenuto Cellini. Cellini was not a jeweler at first, he was a goldsmith and a bronze caster and a sculptor. So the guild, the corporation of jobs, were just considering all these jobs together, all these professions together, without separating them. So being a sculptor and being a jeweler was part of the same training.
I think Victor Hugo said he was the Cellini of our time.
Definitely, he said it.
He said yes.
Yeah. Which is one of the best things you can say for such an artist at the time. And another fabulous masterpiece and artist for the jewelry arts was René Lalique. This example, about 1900, a bit before, is one of the pieces Lalique displayed representing a peacock. The peacock is here, making with his tail a circular shape with this beautiful color of enameling. The head is just jumping out of this sort of bush of feathers, we could say, with this lovely decoration mixing the blue-green of the enameling and the yellow of the gold with moonstones in the center of each feather, as you would see. It's a very sculptural piece, and we know that Lalique was very close to sculptures. His own casters, the Ledru brothers, were actually the same bronze casters as Rodin, the famous sculptors in the late 19th century. But out of it, Lalique understood since 1894 that he had to display his pieces not just with the jewelers, but also in the Salon of Artists, the exhibition of the fine arts from the Beaux-Arts school. And he was in the section dedicated to the sculptures, so not with the jewelers, to perfectly make the people understand this is art. And this piece from 1899, completely in this context, is fabulous because in the back you have a pin, of course, but you can remove the pin and put the brooch as if it was a sculpture, which gives you a perfect idea how he understood his art as a work of sculpture in a way.
And his wife was Madame Ledru as well.
She was related to the Ledru family,
yes.
Definitely. So completely related, to the sculptor's work.
From beginning to end.
Yeah.
We wanted to actually, Gislain mentioned sculpture. Here we're literally in fine artists who start to do jewelry. So whether it be a painter or a sculptor, it's a fairly modern concept, this idea. For example, Lambert Ruki, who was a great sculptor from Poland who worked in Montparnasse, La Ruche, etc. And he paired up with Jean Fouquet, the great jeweler, the grandson of Alphonse Fouquet, and the son of Georges Fouquet, the great Art Nouveau jeweler. And Jean Fouquet was complete modernist. He was in the Union of Modern Artists. He said jewels should be made of shapes that can be seen from afar. And you see he shared that same idea with Lambert Ruki, who was also a cubist, very modernist sculpture. So the jewel is a sculpture, and it almost has this beautiful movement with the way that those little pegs are laid out. And so it's one of the early versions of these kind of collaborations in the 30s. And on the right, Georges Braque, the great cubist painter, he decided, he believed, I think he knew he was ill, it was 1961, he decided to have Heger de Löwenfeld, a jeweler, transcribe his gouache paintings of Greek mythology. And they've become classics. This is Hecate. She's actually the goddess of the moon. And she's very mysterious, and she can represent the waning moon, or she can represent the new moon. And here he has her in turquoise and diamonds. And Heger de Löwenfeld, look at that rough gold work, which is very typical, we were talking about that earlier, of the late 50s and 60s. So these jewels that are literally designed by a fine artist, but made by somebody else, it's something that will become much more common in the 50s and 60s. And today, of course, we take it for granted. But it was something very new, and in fact, some bench jewelers who make everything from beginning to end, they ask the question, is it really your jewel or work of art if someone else is making it? I'm just putting that hypothesis out there. I'm not taking either side, but it's interesting that the jewelers like Calder, who did everything from beginning to end, so this idea of the jewel as sculpture really comes full circle, doesn't it?
And they probably gave to the brooch a new status, a new position since the 50s as a work of art.
But literally with the same idea, even though we think they're all works of art.
Absolutely.
Because we're jewelry lovers.
Same period, from the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, there is a great moment for the brooches. In particular, the animal representation. The bestiary probably has a so large way of being inspired that most of the jewelers at the time decided to use it. We have 4 examples right here. On the left side, we have an example of the very high jewelry type of production that Cartier produced. Doesn't mean the other ones did not, high jewelry. We just wanted to compare and make an example. Look at the engraved emeralds over there. It gives the quality of the stones. It's a very gemmy type of piece of jewelry over there. Compared to the 3 others by Donald Claflin for Tiffany, or Fulco di Verdura, this great Italian jeweler that moved to New York, or even Van Cleef & Arpels from Paris, that decided to represent funny animals with a very nice, original type of look. The giraffe looks like she's a very gentle figure. The little lion is absolutely not aggressive. Please just go closer. I mean, look at his little face. It's a funny face over there, and it gives a nice mood in it. Or even the squirrel of Donald Claflin give this idea of just a running animal over there. But these 4 figures, they have one point in common. They all were, because they were born or because they decided to settle in the United States, in particular in New York. I mean, Cartier and Van Cleef were in New York for a long time. Claflin and Tiffany were there, and Fulco di Verdura moved there by choice. And all this inspiration was probably linked to the story of cartoons, where the animals were just having fun. I mean, it's part of the common context, which probably explains this very funny aspect in these pieces of jewelry.
And you know, I also read Verdura, when he was a young, wealthy prince in Italy, he had animals. He had a menagerie.
Yeah, true.
He had a baboon, he had a camel. So I don't know that he had a giraffe, but he knew,
he probably knew the wild animals, for sure. Yeah.
So we wanted to show you, we wanted to choose the brooch as a work of art from some Asian. We had a really hard time choosing because there's so many good jewelers right now,
True.
artist jewelers. So we wanted to show you what the brooch is doing in two great jewelers from Asia, Cindy Chow and Wallace Chan. I'm sure you've all heard of. Cindy Chow, what's interesting is her grandfather was an architect and her father was a sculptor. And so she really she has this sense also of botany. She takes you into a world where it's deep with that beautiful cushion cut sapphire. She uses lacquer, she uses titanium, and her stones are often rose cut and very transparent. So her jewels, when you look at them from the back, they're just as beautiful. You can see through this flower as if you could see every vein. And she says that her life being around a sculptor, and she also studied, of course, fashion design and many other things. She's a gemologist. And she broke through largely through auction houses. It's this newish fad, and she was one of the great artists, the first artist from Taiwan who was represented at Christie's. So she, of course, has her own shops and everything, but art fairs and the art market are vehicles for some of these really artist jewelers. And Wallace Chan, I don't think he needs any introduction. These are my personal photos from the TIFF-off a few years ago. So he uses imperial jade to make this incredibly realistic and vibrant cicada, which, as you all know, in China is full of symbolism. The jade cicada, I believe sometimes you put it in the mouth of deceased, it will help their spirit be reborn. And he has a very special way of treating the jade that makes it extremely thin. Of course, it's patented. He keeps his secrets. He also has a link to sculpture. He was a sculptor of Buddhist temples. So again, this very luxurious yet very symbolic. And the brooch can be, it's a work of art when you're not wearing the brooch, you put it on that beautiful leaf as a sculpture. So.
And it's true that these art fairs, they gave a lot to considering as works of art, as sculptures, the brooches. We have to keep in mind that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the brooch was not really in, we could say. It was not on fashion. The reality is that we use the expression, the granny's brooch, because they would wear them on the lapel of their suit. So it's just, of the jacket. So it's really something that was not on favor. But 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we saw from the social media, we saw from other worlds, this hashtag coming up, bring the brooch back. And it's the reality that the interest, the passion for the brooch just made that many jewelers, many wearers, many people with the same passion as we are for brooches decided to bring it back. So
let's bring it back.
Yeah, let's bring it back. And in a contemporary aspect, we wanted to see three very different but same period today, the interest that the brooch had in them. Let's start from the left with Boucheron. This piece is not a contemporary piece, it's from 1905, as you can see. It's an aigrette, so it was a pin that was fixed on the turban of a Maharaja, the one of the state of Kapurthala in India. What is interesting to see is that Boucheron did a contemporary collection very recently with the idea of making a reinterpretation of this particular brooch to be worn in their communication.
It's the new Maharaja.
The new Maharaja collection, indeed. And they want it to be worn in the pictures by female and male models. So they understood this idea that the brooch could be one of the perfect objects to be genderless, which is a very hot topic, I would say, today. And it proves that the brooch brings also a lot of meaning for this piece.
And in the middle, we wanted to talk about these animals. This was Arche Noé, Noah's Ark. You know the story, that Noah chooses a female and a male of every species before the great flood and saves them. And the Maison decided to create something like 60 different pairs of animals. And here you have the toucans, and they're clips with the two pins on the back. And they're beautifully sculpted in onyx and beautiful gemstones. You have Tsavorite garnets, you have mandarin garnets, and the toucans, they each have a different position, and they can be worn together or separately. So it's a new way of wearing a clip that was, I find, very unusual and revolutionary at the time. It was a beautiful exhibition that they did here on the Place Vendôme. But to say that you could perceivably as a couple, each one wear one of the two brooches?
Yeah, it's another way of considering how to wear it. And last but not least, on the right-hand side, we have decided to show you this brooch by Fermail, this great German
The
house
metal
that we
maker.
talked about before. And what is really interesting in it is that not only they are making something contemporary, but also they are reusing something from the past. And today, the 21st century is always talking about this idea of upcycling, giving a new life to pieces from the past. Cameos like this one are some of the prestigious objects from the heritage of jewelry, which is nice to give a twist with a new look, with a contemporary look over there. And it proves also how contemporary jewelers could reinterpret, could reconsider in a way how the celebrated, we could say, objects of the past could really have a new life in a modern way.
That cameo is just stunning, isn't it?
It's just, yeah, mind-blowing, really beautiful in it. And it proves also that the interest, even for cameo that was completely out of fashion for many years, is brought back to life in the same time as brooches. This will be our final word. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Stay with us because we're going to ask you to answer to your questions, you have asked via the chats, via WeChat or on Zoom. But before we leave, just a quick information. This talk, of course, has been recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel of the school in a couple of weeks. In 3 weeks, approximately, early May, you will have the new talk that will be dedicated to glyptic arts, cameos and intaglios. Once again, our interest for cameos will be properly understood with this piece, and we will have the luck to welcome Philippe Nicolas, who's a master of art, engraver, and stone sculpture from Maison Cartier, who will be partnering for this talk with our dear Olivier Segura, the scientific director of the school. And this topic will be presented from GEM Genève, the German Art Fair, early May. So you can write and even register now thanks to the QR code. So now it's your time for sending the questions, and I'm sure our dear colleagues...
has been fiendishly collecting them from three different sources.
She definitely is. Thank you so much to Inezita, but also Alice and Mina for being on the chat with you.
For today.
Okay, so... let me check. Will military badges, medals, and other designs be outsourced to luxury jewelry, watchmakers, and luxury brands? Who made these pieces for the dignitaries?
Actually, that's an interesting question. Hemmerle, of course, the example that we showed you, they started out as making medals and honors, and they reconverted. In fact, I think it was Stéphane, the generation right before the present. A client asked him to make a ring out of Berlin iron of a lady who loved that style, but it had a beautiful diamond. So they started having the idea to use unusual metals. So Hemmerle is known for using beautiful treated aluminums and different treatments of the gold, etc. So in that case, it was sort of a natural fit. They started doing jewelry, of course, much earlier than 1995. But there are other companies. In France, I think you have somebody who specialized just in the metals.
They are...
Bertrand...
yes, I think some of their offices or boutiques in the Palais Royal.
And
they have places.
Melario does awards. Melario does awards. They do for sports. The great Melario, 15th generation of jewelers in the same family. They do awards for sports and other things as well.
Yeah.
So it does exist. And I think sometimes there's collections and maisons that are inspired by military insignia.
Absolutely.
It does happen every so often.
But it's true that most of the time the goldsmith and jewelers, they share the same techniques, so they could do both at many ways. There's a question again about the suffragette jewelry colors. Yeah, I know it's a very, very British thing initially, but because it was talking about the women to vote, it's something universal, I should say. It's just you take the first letter of each color, green, white, violet. So G for green, W for white, V for violet, and each letter gives a new word. G for give, W, women, V, the vote. So give women the vote. So it was the idea
Oh,
is it? Thank you. So just give you the idea how powerful could be a message with these simple colors and how strong it was in this British context, mostly at the time. Okay. Is belt buckle also a symbol of power? Feels like it's not only for decoration, like China Imperial also wears it, but more like a symbol of power.
That's a good question. Probably, you probably are right. I think the idea, you mean the belt fastener?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, of course. I think you can all correct me because you're all specialists in Asian art, but I think jade, the idea that it has jade involved, and it has that dragon and the little baby dragon and the lichin, this whole idea of the cycle, the dragon representing, of course, the sky, immortality, as well as jade. So I would say yes. I would dare to say that yes, perhaps that belt hook was and is a symbol of power as well.
In many cultures,
by its materials and by its symbolism as well.
I know for the very early Middle Ages, the Merovingian dynasty, for example, they had huge belt buckles. They were for the leaders. So you really had this idea that it's a symbol of power, and probably for many, jewelry. It's one of the meaning of jewelry, bringing power and reveal power with these luxurious objects. So it can be this way of reading them, for sure.
Yes, the idea of utilitarian objects and that show munificence through their rich materials. I think that's a theme, not only Asian, but like you said.
In the world, yeah.
Exactly.
In the world, absolutely. As the current fashion trend is getting more casual these days, how you see these brooches to match with fashion trends? Well, as we have seen with the explanation we have given, even casual brooches have been produced. When we talk about brooches, and we have seen with these simple plastic pins or badges, the brooches in a large way can be with precious or non-precious materials. And even for some casual objects, you can actually wear them. And we've seen them on hats, or using with scarves, using with the simple clothing, and just pinning them anywhere you want. So it's something that becomes more and more important, even without the idea of the pin, which is piercing not the body for sure, but piercing the clothing. Also, we were talking about this yesterday with magnetic way of fixing it. So it gives also new twist of how you can wear brooches differently. So I'm very sure, I'm hoping at the same time, brooches, they have a long life ahead in terms of development.
And we've also seen a renaissance of men wearing brooches.
Definitely. On the red carpet.
On the red carpet, everywhere in fashion magazines. I think it's becoming, we're allowed to reappropriate, even we men can wear brooches.
Sure,
again,
we will. We do.
We have a great example next to me.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thanks. Oh, well, you were talking about Christian Dior before. Was he the very first to make costume jewelry? And how do you define costume jewelry?
He was, as far as I understand, he was one of the first couturiers to actually, license and make jewelry as part of his collections. And of course, others have done it as well. Of course, Yves Saint Laurent, who was one of his after he died, took over the maison. And but what the interesting about Dior, he said the new look has to be from head to toe. So he wanted women to have quality things to wear. In his shop, which he called Codifiché, it was let's say a little accessory shop from the beginning, 1947.
Yeah.
And women loved it. He had beautiful jewelry made by very famous jewelry makers, costume jewelry makers. And I think he did start the trend. I would say yes. Mm-hmm. He was really a visionary in that sense of using really high quality producers for gems. Coco Chanel, of course, did it before that. We can't deny. She did the pearls and the bakelite bracelets in the 20s. Yeah. But it was just sort of as part of a collection of couture. I think he was probably one of the first.
Quite pioneer, let's say.
One of the first, let's say. It's always hard to say.
There was a question also about how the iron jewels were made, hand or lost wax. It's very interesting to see. It was produced mostly by a sand casting in a foundry, which is interesting. I'm reading for the rest of the question. The idea is that the item was pressed into damp sand to create the mold, and then when the sand was dried, melted wax was poured into the impression and used to cast properly the iron. Most of the time there was I'm saying there about the method, also the question, there was a black lacquer finish which was applied to the surface of the piece. So it's a very technical side of producing it with a traditional technique.
Exactly, it was very traditional, but it was also for arms at first and heavier, big items. So the fact that they made, and the black surface, they would make little cakes of linseed oil, and they would let's say burn the linseed oil, and that coating, that's what would coat it to make it black. I don't know how I remember that, but I do.
There's things like that, techniques that we just come to us this way.
Things come to your...
let's pick up a final question as time flies, as you can figure out. But I love this question, so I'm just so many questions we have to pick up. It's the final one I just received about Art Deco bar brooches. I just love them, so that's why I'm just picking up this one. They're very beautiful and discreet. It's very true. Was it worn by women or men? I have never found information about how it was worn by people.
Which types of brooches? The dress clips?
The bar brooches.
Oh, bar brooches. They could be
Yeah.
worn, I think they were worn sometimes on men's ties.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
the men wore them sometimes, yes. As a brooch, perhaps not.
As a brooch, no.
On the lapel?
Probably on the ties,
But
yeah.
I think probably men probably did wear them.
Yeah, they
I
were
believe so.
some of the small, very minimalistic, we
Right.
could say, and delicate. They were worn on the ties. This is one of the options. Mostly for the women, they would wear them on the hats, as we said, little bell hats, if you know, or even, of course, on the lapel, on the little dresses. But it's interesting to see that. Speaking of wearing, we were talking about red carpets. Art Deco brooches, they have a big success today on red carpets. I'm thinking particularly on the Met Gala in particular. I just have in mind Timothée Chalamet,
Yes,
who wore beautiful...
He was the one who started the whole trend.
Oh yes,
wasn't he?
beautiful Art Deco pieces at the moment. And this is really also a way to bring back the pieces, wearing contemporary brooches or bringing back to life these vintage brooches that could be perfectly worn with a modern suit, for sure, for both men and women. So it's really interesting to have this in mind. And this is on this contemporary note that we're going to conclude. Thank you so much once again for being with us today. We hope you enjoy, as we did and we do, this very important topic. For sure, if you have any more questions, do not hesitate to write via the social media to us. We'll be very thrilled to answer to these questions of yours. Have a lovely day or evening, depending on where you are at the moment. And we're looking forward to having you for our next talk in May. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. See you soon.